Right now, somewhere in northern Nigeria, a clay pot is keeping tomatoes fresh for 3 weeks. No plug, no compressor, no monthly electric bill. Just 2 clay pots, some sand, and water. That's it. And the thing that gets me, the thing I keep coming back to, is that this isn't some experimental prototype sitting in a lab. This is a technique that human beings have been using for thousands of years. Thousands. And yet, if you walked into any home improvement store today and asked someone about it, they'd look at you like you'd lost your mind. Because somewhere along the way, between the invention of Freon and the explosion of suburban kitchens in the 1950s, this piece of knowledge just quietly disappeared from everyday life. I stumbled onto this about 2 years ago when I was researching off-grid cooling for a completely different project. And the deeper I dug, the more frustrated I got. Not because the information was hidden exactly. It's out there in academic papers and development aid reports. But because something this practical, this elegant, this cheap, had somehow never made it into the conversation most of us are having about energy costs and sustainability. So today, I'm going to walk you through exactly how this works. The science, the history, the build, and the honest limitations. Because you deserve to know about a cooling method that costs less than a sandwich and runs on nothing but evaporation. Here's something that might sting a little. You're spending somewhere between $60 and $100 a year just to keep your food cold. Your refrigerator, that humming box in your kitchen, is one of the top 3 energy consumers in your entire house. It runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. It never stops. And look, modern refrigerators are genuinely impressive machines. I'm not here to trash them. But what bugs me is that most people don't even realize there are alternative approaches to cooling that don't require a single watt of electricity. Not as a complete replacement. Let me be clear about that. But as a supplement, a backup, an option. Think about this for a second. If your power goes out for 3 days after a storm, and if you've been through that, you know exactly what I'm talking about. What happens to everything in your fridge? It's gone. Hundreds of dollars worth of food just done. Now what if I told you that for about $5 and 20 minutes of work, you could build something that would keep your produce cool enough to survive exactly that kind of situation? Not frozen, not 34 degrees, but cool enough to dramatically extend the life of fruits, vegetables, and some dairy products. That's not a sales pitch. That's thermodynamics. About 5,000 years ago, somebody in Egypt figured out something that modern engineering textbooks still teach as a core thermodynamic principle. We don't know their name. We don't know if it was an accident or an intentional experiment. But what we know is this. They discovered that when water evaporates, from a porous surface, it pulls heat away from that surface. The surface gets cooler. That's it. That's the entire foundation. It's the same reason you feel cold when you step out of a swimming pool on a breezy day. The water on your skin is evaporating, and as it transitions from liquid to gas, it absorbs thermal energy from your body. Your skin gets cooler. You shiver. The Egyptians used this principle with porous clay jars. They'd store water in them, and the water that seeped through the clay walls would evaporate on the outside, cooling the contents inside. Archaeologists have found these vessels at sites dating back to around 2500 BCE. But it wasn't just Egypt. Variations of this same idea popped up independently across North Africa, the Middle East, India, and parts of Spain. The technology had different names in different places, different shapes, different local materials, but the principle was always identical. Evaporation equals cooling. In parts of what is now Iran, they built massive structures called yakshals, essentially ancient evaporative ice, houses that could produce and store ice in the desert. In the desert. Without electricity, without any mechanical components, just smart architecture and an understanding of how heat and water interact. And for centuries, this was just how people kept things cool. It was common knowledge, the kind of thing everyone knew, like how to start a fire or preserve meat with salt. Then, something changed. All right, Let's get into why this actually works, because it's not magic. It's physics doing exactly what physics does. The principle is called the latent heat of vaporization. Here's what that means in plain language. When water changes from a liquid to a gas, when it evaporates, it needs energy to make that transition. And it takes that energy in the form of heat from whatever surface it's sitting on. So picture this. You've got two unglazed clay pots. One is smaller than the other. You put the small one inside the big one. In the gap between them, you pack wet sand. Then you put a wet cloth over the top. The water in that sand starts to evaporate through the porous outer pot. As it evaporates, it pulls heat from the inner pot. The inner pot gets cooler. The food inside the inner pot, your tomatoes, your peppers, your mangoes, whatever you're storing, stays at a lower temperature than the outside air. How much cooler? That depends on your climate. In hot, dry environments, which is where this technique performs best, the temperature inside the Aweitsdiu inner pot can drop 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit below ambient temperature. In some documented cases, even more than that. Let me put that in perspective. If it's 100 degrees outside, a scorching day, the inside of your Zeer pot could be sitting around 80 degrees. That's not refrigerator cold, no. But it's the difference between tomatoes lasting 3 days and tomatoes lasting 3 weeks. That's not my number. That's from field studies conducted in sub-Saharan Africa, where these devices have been deployed at scale. The key variable is humidity. This whole system runs on evaporation, and evaporation happens fastest when the surrounding air is dry. In a desert, this thing is a powerhouse. In a humid subtropical climate, say, Florida in August, the performance drops significantly because the air is already saturated with moisture. Water can't evaporate efficiently when the air is already full of it. That's an honest limitation. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But in dry to moderate climates, this is legitimately effective. In 1995, a Nigerian teacher named Mohammed Ba Abba looked at a problem nobody in the developed world was paying attention to. In rural northern Nigeria, farmers, especially women who sold produce at markets, were losing enormous amounts of food to spoilage. No electricity, no refrigeration infrastructure, temperatures routinely above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Ba Abba knew about the pot-in-pot concept from traditional practices in the region, but he did something remarkable. He standardized it, optimized the design, and then distributed tens of thousands of them to farming communities. He called it the Zeer pot, and he essentially dedicated years of his life to making sure people had access to it. The results were striking. Produce that previously spoiled within 2 days was lasting upwards of 3 weeks. Farmers could sell their goods over a longer period, which directly increased their income. Girls who had been pulled out of school to sell produce quickly before it spoiled were able to return to their education because the urgency of immediate sale disappeared. In 2000, Ba Abba received the Rolex Award for Enterprise for this work. This wasn't fringe science or some untested idea. This was recognized, documented, and verified. And yet, and this is the part that I find genuinely puzzling, this barely registered in mainstream awareness in most developed countries. Ask 10 people on the street what a Zeer pot is, and you'll get 10 blank stares. So if this works, and it demonstrably does, why aren't we all using it? Here's where I have to be straight with you, because I know the instinct. The instinct is to say that big appliance manufacturers buried this to protect their business. And I get why that feels satisfying as an explanation. But the real answer is honestly less dramatic and more frustrating. Electric refrigeration won. It won because it works in every climate, maintains precise temperatures, and scales to any size. When reliable electricity became widespread across North America and Europe in the mid-20th century, evaporative cooling simply became unnecessary for most households. It wasn't suppressed, it was outcompeted. But here's what did happen, and this part matters. Once electric refrigeration became the standard, the knowledge of evaporative cooling techniques stopped being passed down. It fell out of school curricula, out of home economics classes, out of everyday conversation. Within a generation or two, a technique that had been common knowledge for millennia just evaporated. Pun intended. And that's the real loss. Not because everyone needs to replace their refrigerator with clay pots. Obviously they don't. But because having this knowledge in your back pocket gives you an option. It gives you resilience. It means that when the power grid fails, or when you're camping, or when you're trying to reduce your energy footprint, you're not helpless. You know something useful. The interesting thing is that companies like GE and Westinghouse were certainly aware of evaporative cooling principles. These are fundamental thermodynamics. But there was no commercial incentive to promote a $5 solution made from clay when they were selling appliances for hundreds of dollars. That's not a conspiracy. That's just how markets work. Here's what you need, and I'm serious about the price. This costs almost nothing. One large unglazed terracotta pot. When I say unglazed, I mean it. The kind that's rough and porous, not the shiny coated ones. You can find these at any garden center. Depending on size, $2 to $4. One smaller unglazed terracotta pot that fits inside the larger one with about a 1 to 2 inch gap all the way around. Usually $1 or $2. Clean sand. Enough to fill the gap between the two pots. Play sand from a hardware store works fine. A couple of bucks for a bag, and you'll have way more than you need. Water. From your tap. A piece of cloth. A towel, burlap, cotton fabric, whatever you have around. Optional, a small piece of tile, a flat stone, or some duct tape to cover the drainage hole in the bottom of the larger pot. You want to keep the water in the sand, not draining out. First, plug the drainage hole in the larger pot. A small piece of tile held in place with waterproof adhesive or even duct tape works fine. You just need to keep water from running straight out the bottom. Place the larger pot on a surface where airflow can reach it, not on carpet or sealed flooring. A wire rack, a few bricks, or even an overturned baking sheet works. You want air moving around the outer pot to encourage evaporation. Pour a layer of sand into the bottom of the large pot, about 1 inch or 2 deep. Set the smaller pot inside, centered. Make sure the rims of both pots are roughly level. Fill the gap between the pots with sand all the way to the top. Pack it gently. You don't want huge air pockets, but don't compress it so tightly that water can't move through it. Now saturate the sand with water. Pour slowly and let it soak in. You want the sand thoroughly wet, but not a swimming pool. The sand should be damp all the way through. Place your produce, fruits, vegetables, even some cheeses, inside the inner pot. Cover the top with your damp cloth. That cloth is important. It extends the evaporative surface area and helps cool the air inside the pot. That's it. You're done. Rehydrate the sand 2 to 3 times per day. In hot weather, just pour water around the gap until the sand is wet again. If you're in a very hot, dry climate, you might need to water it more frequently. The cloth on top should be re-wetted as well. Place this in a spot with good airflow. A breezy area is ideal. Not in direct sunlight if you can avoid it, since that works against the cooling. A shaded porch, a covered outdoor area, or even a well-ventilated room works. Important safety note: this does not replace refrigeration for meat, fish, or anything that requires temperatures below 40 degrees Fahrenheit to remain safe. This is primarily for produce, and results depend on your local climate. Always use common sense about food safety, and when in doubt, consult food storage guidelines from a reliable source. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you, this replaces your kitchen fridge, because it doesn't. If you live in a humid climate, your results will be modest at best. If you need to store raw meat or keep milk at 36 degrees, this isn't the tool for that job. And let me be specific about what humid climate means here. If your relative humidity regularly sits above 65 or 70%, the evaporative effect drops off sharply. That's coastal areas, the American Southeast, much of the tropics during monsoon season. The pot still works a little. You might get a 5 or 6 degree drop, but it's nothing like the 15 to 20 degree performance you'll see in arid conditions. So know your climate before you set expectations. There's also the matter of consistency. A refrigerator holds a steady temperature around 37 degrees, regardless of what's happening outside. A Zearpot fluctuates. It's coolest in the afternoon, when the evaporation rate is highest, and less effective overnight when temperatures naturally drop anyway. It's not precision cooling. It's passive, variable, and weather dependent. But here's what it does extremely well. It extends the shelf life of produce significantly in dry to moderate climates. It works completely off-grid. It costs almost nothing. It requires zero technical knowledge to build. And it gives you a backup cooling option that doesn't depend on infrastructure that can fail. I've heard from people who keep one of these on their back porch all summer, just for garden tomatoes and herbs. Others use them at campgrounds where coolers full of ice turn into coolers full of warm water within 48 hours. A few people I've talked to built one during a hurricane season power outage and said it was the difference between losing everything in their crisper drawer and keeping it going for another week and a half. For anyone interested in homesteading, emergency preparedness, camping, or simply understanding how the world worked before we plugged everything into a wall, this is a fundamental piece of knowledge. Once you understand the principle, you start seeing applications everywhere. The same evaporative cooling concept has been used in building design. There are architects right now designing passive cooling systems for buildings in hot climates that reduce air conditioning needs dramatically. Some of these designs use wet screens or porous walls that function on the exact same physics as your clay pot, just at a much larger scale. You can scale this up yourself too. Some people have built larger versions using 5-gallon buckets or even repurposed barrels. Others have experimented with different packing materials, charcoal, perlite, vermiculite, to see what optimizes the evaporative effect. Charcoal, interestingly, seems to hold moisture longer than sand in some tests, which means less frequent rewatering. There are also Zearpot designs adapted for community use in parts of Africa and India, where a single large unit serves an entire market or village cooperative. One design I came across used a series of nested concrete containers that could hold produce for an entire row of market vendors. The principle is the same every time. Water evaporates, heat leaves, things get cooler. Simple as that. You just learned a technique that's older than written language, backed by thermodynamics, and costs less than a coffee. That's not nothing. In a world where most solutions come with a subscription fee or a power cord, knowing how to cool food with clay, sand, and water is the kind of practical knowledge that sticks with you. The kind that actually matters when it counts. And honestly, what I find most powerful about this isn't just the cooling itself, it's what it represents. It's proof that not every good idea needs to be complicated. Not every solution needs a circuit board or a software update. Sometimes the answer was figured out 5,000 years ago by someone whose name we'll never know, using materials they found in the ground. There's something beautiful about that. And there's something important about making sure that knowledge doesn't get lost just because it doesn't come with a profit margin. If this opened your eyes to something you hadn't considered before, I'd appreciate it if you subscribed. I keep digging into overlooked techniques, forgotten knowledge, and practical solutions that most people never hear about. And I'd like you to be here for the next one. Stay curious. I'll see you in the next video.